Hi, welcome to the webinar, starting with the end in mind, what I wish I had known as a new parent. I'm Dr. Natasha Kazanov, and I'm really excited to talk to you about something that I have been exploring and feel very passionate about: how to raise resilient, smart, effective, successful children, and what we need to do in order to promote that. So let me show my business card. This is the brain. This is the part of our body that I fell in love with when I was an undergrad student, and I never stopped exploring the wonders of the brain. Even though we still don't know more than we do know about the brain, what we know now allows us to adjust our parenting, raising kids, understanding using evidence-based approaches. And that's why I'm so excited to talk to you about what I know. But let me first share the screen with you here. And this is my keynote. So, as I said, I have been studying and practicing psychology for over 40 years. And my explanatory model of the human mind is based on brain science. For decades, I have been following cutting-edge research on the human mind and noticed that a few years ago, there were reports made by researchers identifying the two most important cognitive skills to have in order to thrive in the 21st century as creativity and critical thinking. So I started digging deeper and discovered an alarming fact. When researchers in the US measured creativity, thinking out of the box, they discovered that at age 5, 95% of kids were creative, and sadly, at age 20, only 5 measured high on those tests. These findings made me go, what's going on there? Why do we lose this incredibly valuable feature of our mind as we age? What do you think? Every invention, innovation, scientific breakthrough, every contribution to the arts or literature, it all requires creativity. So let's explore this together. Are you willing to participate in an experiment requiring you to use these vital 21st century skills? Creativity starts with imagination, so we'll begin there. Before we commit to doing this, let's assess our skills by asking ourselves, how good is my imagination? Am I a good critical thinker? If you're at least passable on these, let's give it a try. I invite you to harness the power of your imagination as we look at 3 case scenarios. 1, imagine yourself as a language teacher. I'm your prospective student, and I need you to teach me how to speak Chinese. Would you agree if I promise to be a good student? Okay. If that's a language you speak fluently, I hope you said yes. Now imagine that I asked you to teach the language you don't know. Let's say German. Would you agree at this time? I suspect you'd say, sorry, no, can't do. Now let's apply critical thinking to this situation. In your opinion, would it be easier for you to teach me Chinese if I am 5 or 65 years old? It is, of course, easier to teach a young child. So what's the link here? I submit to you that we need to teach our children many languages. One of them is the language of feelings. I consider it to be one of the most important languages. Why? Because feelings signal to us our needs, our wants, our desires, and they tell us ultimately who we are. And if we don't identify, understand, and manage our feelings, we cannot connect to ourselves. And then if we cannot connect to ourselves, we cannot effectively connect to other people. But to teach any language to others, we have to speak it ourselves. And the earlier we start learning any language, the easier it is for our brain to learn. As a parent, you hope to be a teacher creating emotional literacy first, then emotional fluency, and later emotional mastery. It doesn't happen quickly. As a psychologist, I work with very successful people. Most of my clients are highly educated professionals, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and yet when they call for an appointment, to see me, they feel depressed, anxious, or stressed out. It breaks my heart how many people who have everything they need to feel content and joyful are not. In 2013, depression became number one reason for disability in the whole world. What happens in therapy can often be viewed as reparenting. I help my clients to change their mind habits from the ones that keep them stuck to the ones that allow them to thrive. I often have to start by helping my clients acquire the emotional literacy and fluency they may be lacking that they haven't acquired in childhood. After many years of practice of repeating this process with client after client, I decided to go to the source to help parents and teachers to do the job of teaching kids to be successful and happy so that they will not need reparenting down the road. But parenting doesn't only require an element of teaching. After all, it is the hardest job in the world. So for now, erase all that you imagined when you were a teacher and ask yourself instead to imagine yourself being a computer programmer whose task is to create a program. Would you agree to write the code for a program without first asking what this program would be designed to do? Of course not. As parents, we show our children how to think, and by doing so, we program their minds. But first, we need to know what kind of thinker we'd like to create, right? Yet, oftentimes, when I ask new parents what they would like to teach their children, they say, "Oh, I just want my child to be successful." And when I respond, "Well, you are successful, right? Do you want your child to be just like you?" Most often the answer is, "No, I want my child to do better, feel better, be better." Then I say, "Okay, let's figure out what successful means." More on that later. For now, let's take a few deep, slow, quiet, and regular breaths and clear our minds for the next scenario. We are wiping the slate clean, removing the trappings of a computer programmer. This time, can you imagine instead that you are an architect? Really see yourself in your mind's eye. And the question I'd like you to ponder is, would you design and oversee construction of a building from the foundation up or from the top floor down? Well, the foundation must go first, right? Our little ones are born with very underdeveloped brains, and major assembly is required. As parents, we facilitate experiences for our little ones that create the architecture of their brains. And as we would be doing with the building, we need to begin with the foundation before trying to construct the top floor. The foundation is feelings, the top floor is thinking. With that in mind, you are now appointed to be an architect of your child and his or her future brain. But we are still not quite done. To reward you for all the hard imaginary work so far, the last question is a definite no-brainer. Clear your mind one last time and imagine yourself as a real estate developer. If you had some money to invest, would you want to purchase property in the area that would appreciate the most? Of course. By now, may be able to predict where I'm going with this. Our brain is like real estate we can invest into and develop. There are areas in the adult brain that are responsible for fear, flexibility, empathy, understanding of our feelings, executive functioning, decision making. Some areas will develop without any input. For example, the sensory areas, smell, vision, hearing. But some areas of the brain are experience dependent, meaning that they need to be invested in and encouraged to grow. In this talk, I will show to you that some areas of the brain of a child will guarantee a high return on your investment. I call it the magic wand of the brain. Here's my magic wand. The magic wand part of the brain is the one that takes the longest to mature. It is prefrontal cortex. It is also called the organ of civilization. So we've tried on several careers. Now that we've warmed up, let's go to work. I'd like you to imagine that you've been given a project, the most important one you'll get in your career, a newborn baby. And your job is to teach that child how to be an effective human by the time she or he is your age. Where do you begin? I propose that we start with the end in mind and apply what evidence-based approaches allow us to do with confidence and little trial and error. Thus far, I have invited you to use your imagination and critical thinking because, unlike very young children, you have a brain that is fully developed and you can access different parts of your brain that help you perform different functions. What we focus on, we can connect to, and you can, as a parent and pedagogue, we are tasked with the most challenging and the most gratifying job there is, developing the brains of our children so that we can create successful adults. In order to do that job well, it is imperative that we be brain teachers, brain programmers, brain architects, and brain real estate developers. We need to teach our kids to be cognitively and emotionally competent. That will allow them to keep creativity and critical thinking. Being both cognitively and emotionally competent is not easy, and it requires time, energy, and skills in parents who will develop those kids. But I'm confident that after learning new ways of thinking and picking up those skills, you will feel empowered. Let's pause here, though. I can see your faces and I don't know what you are thinking. But if I were in your shoes, I know by now I would feel probably a little anxious and antsy, thinking, oh my God, I have no idea how to be an architect and a teacher, how to be a programmer. I have no idea what real estate she is talking about. So if you are feeling these feelings of anxiety, if you are thinking these thoughts, I get it. But let's just acknowledge something. When we are stressed out, we are not likely to run well. So that's why I use the stoplight analogy to introduce this idea that our brain can be in the red zone, and red is fight, flight, freeze, or appease response. This is when our nervous system is activated and stress hormones are released into our bloodstream, and everything that doesn't serve survival is inhibited. And then green zone is when we are good, when we are joyful and we are happy. At that point in time, our brain is very powerful and I would say unstoppable. So, but our brain only knows how to do red or green. So I introduced this idea of going into the yellow. So yellow is acknowledging that maybe you feel a little confused now, maybe you feel a little impatient, what she's talking about. So let's restore calm. Let's go into the green zone. And the way I usually do it, I put my hands on my chest and I take a few deep, slow, quiet, and regular breaths. If you are comfortable doing it with me, please do so. One of the most effective ways of restoring your breathing and your sanity is by breathing in on count four, not breathing count four, and out count four. Just listening to your body, listening to your heart. And now I'm inviting you to set the intention of learning as much as you can during the remainder of the webinar, provided that some of the concepts may be very difficult and confusing. This is my mantra, and I want you also to use it. I'm connecting to my heart, and my intention is to learn as much as I can and be compassionate, and curious at the same time. All right, just a few deep, slow, quiet, and regular breaths. And now let's continue. So, the good news is now we know so much about what works when it comes to raising good humans. The bad news that here in the United States, in spite of all the cool psychology and neuroscience research published every day, we are not doing a good job. 6 million American kids are on antidepressants, and suicide rates are on the rise along with addictions, especially in the wealthy, high socioeconomic status families. My heart hurts for those parents who deal with their children's psychological vulnerabilities. I do believe that prevention is the best treatment, and that's what brings me here today. So, what I want to communicate to you, and I hope you will be open to remembering it, is that what happens in childhood doesn't stay in childhood. As parents and teachers, we need to take responsibility for hardwiring helpful, not hurtful mind habits. It's so much easier to create good mind habits now than it is to change hurtful mind habits later. And the most important mind habit to hardwire, I'm suggesting to you, is joy and happiness. The foremost, longest lasting study on happiness, it is referred to as the Harvard Happiness Study here in the United States, lasted almost 80 years. Many people, including famous people, were included in the study. And the not so surprising finding was that the most powerful factor in happiness, in predicting happiness, is the ability to build healthy social connections and build collaborative relationships. Well, this is something that we learn in childhood. So we can pretty assuredly say that happiness has to do with relationships. And that means happiness has everything to do with love. By loving our children, we can communicate to them that they're worthy of love, and then they can continue building on those skills of emotional intelligence. But let me share my story that eventually led me to the deep interest in raising competent, compassionate kids and ultimately developing my SMART program. Um, this is the story that I use as a way of explaining why it is more difficult than we think to be an effective parent. I had my son when I was 22. He's 43 now, and I'm really proud of him. He's brilliant, polite, financially, and professionally successful. But he also tends to be a perfectionist, and he can be so hard on himself that sometimes he avoids taking risks out of fear of failure. Fear of failure thwarts creativity and critical thinking. When my son was born, I was about to graduate from a master's program in psychology. I was in love with him from the moment I found out I was pregnant. I always wanted to be a mother. I considered myself well equipped to be a mom in spite of my young age. After all, I studied developmental psychology, brain development, social psychology. I always knew what I would have done differently, better, when I was observing other mothers handling their kids' meltdowns and escalating the conflict instead of disarming the child. Yes, I was judging those moms, and I've come to realize that sometimes we are better parents when we don't have kids. I was armed with all my education, and I was determined to be a great mom. My son was a happy baby, easy to take care of. Met all his milestones. I used flashcards to teach him to read, and he started reading at age 3. Oh, I was so proud. I stayed home with him until he was over 2 years old, at which point I went to work as a psychologist at the big psychiatric hospital. Working in the hospital created more stress than I thought. My boss was not very supportive when my child was sick. My husband and my mother both disagreed with my parenting practices that were pretty permissive. Being a great mom was my goal, but that became more difficult than ever. One day, I was in the store with my son, who was a little over 3 years old at this point, and he was having a meltdown because he wanted a toy I couldn't afford. I was doing my best, but the more I tried, the more out of control he was. The usual tricks did nothing to subdue his crying and screaming. At the end of my rope, I flipped my lid. I was angry and I began yelling at him to stop. It had the opposite effect. He was more and more out of control. I grabbed him and carried him outside. He looked at me and declared, I hate you. You're not my mom. You're a bad witch. Ouch. I was devastated. I remember calling my mom that night to tell her what happened, and she said, see, you have to stop being so permissive. You have to punish him for this. Oh, I wish I had a better advisor. But at that time, I hadn't heard of Dr. Pickler's approach. The only authority I knew was Dr. Spock, who said children need to learn how to self regulate, arguing that being responsive to their needs after 3 months of age spoils them. So I listened to authority, my husband, my mom, and Dr. Spock. Oh, the wars waged over pancakes being too big, scarves being too scratchy, wanting to wear blue instead of brown. I responded to my son with timeouts, determined not to let him manipulate me into submissiveness. I so wish I had known about Dr. Pickler's approach. I did some things right in those early years with my son. For example, I invested into his cognitive development early on, and he's incredibly smart, but it was building the house from the top down, not from the bottom up. Between 3 and 5, this is where boundary setting becomes the most important task. What happened in my childhood created shame in me. So when my son tried to tell me that he needed me melting down in the middle of the store, instead of being his attuned parent, my shame was activated and I threw a tantrum myself. In that moment, I was not talking to the right part of his brain and entirely missed what he communicated to me. We have so many different parenting schools and approaches now in the US. And at times, new parents become overwhelmed and confused. Who do I listen to? On top of that, oftentimes parenting advice is hurtful, not helpful. Over my years of working with patients and parents, I've learned that it's best to filter my approaches through the prism of teach them now what they need later. And by that metric, Dr. Bittler is unmatched. An intuitive neuroscientist in her time, she designed a pioneering system that allowed children with a history of trauma to thrive. And now we have the cutting edge science to back it up. In the United States, in the 90s, baby Einstein products were launched with the promise made to parents that buying these educational toys and games for their kids would give their children cognitive advantage when they are older. Many parents wanted little Einsteins, but unfortunately, these promises were proven to be false. Well, children whose parents bought baby Einstein products were tested years later. Their IQ scores were either the same or lower than their counterparts. Conclusion: well, this is like building the house from the top down. We need not baby Einsteins, we need baby Buddhas. Babies need to be held, talked to, played with. Having attuned and connected parents creates brains that are less likely to become overwhelmed and shut down in the face of adversity and struggle. That better brain wiring makes it much easier for cognitive skills, thinking, to be downloaded when time is right. When I was parenting my son in my 20s, I wanted him to be smart, baby Einstein. And of course, all parents want their children to be smart. But I failed to model emotional mastery to him. To raise successful adults, we should start with the end product in mind. And that means we need to define success. Most of my clients with depression and anxiety say, I will be happy when, fill in the blank. However, the field of positive psychology, the science of happiness and thriving, has proven beyond any reasonable doubt that happiness allows us to be successful in the way we choose to be when we have the ability to choose. Happiness is not a result, but a precursor to any success. It allows us to be motivated to take risks, which is necessary for the pursuit of success. Happy kids produce successful adults. So let's talk about what it takes to create childhood experiences that will allow your kids to thrive. Do you remember thinking this? I will be happy when I graduate from high school, get married, find a job, have a child. And sometimes it doesn't happen. So today we'll continue delving into the brain-based practices that will help us to do the most challenging and the most gratifying job of all, raising children with more skill and joy. We'll explore how to promote emotional intelligence in ourselves and our children. And we'll learn the SMART with 2 T's checklist. I will just touch on it briefly to assist us with thinking quick while we are on the job. Like any good architect, I lay a good foundation, which for us means the basics of brain development. So, human babies are born with very underdeveloped brains, and major assembly is required. It takes about 2 decades for the human brain to mature. It stops developing. Prefrontal cortex is the latest building block. It stops developing about 20-25 years of age. And there is major construction happening in the first 3 years, and between 3 and 5, there is not as many connections made, but still, it's a very important time. Babies don't know how to think, but they know how to feel. We are born with more neurons in our brains than we'll have as adults. And there is very rapid connecting and pruning happening in the first 5 years of life. In fact, there are between 1 and 2 million neural connections made each second of life. Just think about it. 1 minute, 60 to 120 million neural connections. I find it incredibly mind-blowing. Hardwiring emotional intelligence early in life allows us to create real estate for the young brain that enables it to wire and rewire itself as long as it lives. Our brain will be restructuring itself. Without a solid foundation, it becomes very challenging to develop emotional intelligence later in life. And that the unfortunate result of having children who are not emotionally intelligent is what we see now in the United States. There is the growing epidemic of obesity, violence, high incarceration rates, addiction to what is called now digital heroin, gaming, and computers. So now the studies have shown that there are at least four brain systems that are implicated in creating the sense of well-being and joy and happiness. And as adults, we need to invest into ours, but also help our children develop those. The first one is our ability to maintain positive states, creating happiness. It's also called happiness set point. So creating joy by playing, and what Elsa and Pia talked to you about is really important. The second is the ability to recover from negative states. That means extinguishing difficult emotions, negative emotions. This is what I didn't model for my son when I was young, because I didn't know how to extinguish my emotion of shame. The next one is the ability to focus. Our ability to focus allows to avoid mind wandering, which is a natural tendency of our brain. And when our minds are wandering, we are less likely to be happy, the studies have shown. So the ability to focus is really incredibly important. And this is my favorite. It is the ability to be kind and generous. So kind people are happier. That's why I like sharing my ideas, my education, sharing my love at this point in my life. So the interesting part, though, that the frontal cortex is implicated in all four of these symptoms. So as parents, we can start promoting these symptoms in our children early by using SMART checklists that I will briefly introduce later. And using other interventions like Rye, Pickler, Waldorf, Montessori education, they're all good. That early investment in the most lucrative real estate of our brains, frontal lobes, guarantees high return on investment. Now, a child needs to feel safe, seen, and soothed in order to continue building good prefrontal cortex. This is really important to understand, and this is what I failed to recognize again as a new mom. If caregivers promote these feelings of being seen when the child needs your attention, feeling safe because you don't uh, punish them for having their needs, helping them to be soothed before their brain is ready, then they will grow to be secure. I know that Elsa talked to you about the 4 S's of good parenting. This is from Dan Siegel's and Tina Bryson's work, The Whole Brain Child. And when we are secure, we feel free to be ourselves. And then it is easier for us to manage our feelings when we feel free to experience all our feelings. We can safely say that when it comes to happiness and by extension success, emotional intelligence is more important than one's IQ at this point in time. This is the book by Daniel Goleman. In his groundbreaking book published in 1995, he redefined what it means to be smart by proving that emotional intelligence is the necessary ingredient for good social connections and overall adjustment in life. I am fully convinced that SMART, what I am going to introduce, comes before SMART with 1 T. And we'll talk about SMART in a few moments. All these emotional skills are developed over time and require good teachers, just the way learning reading, writing, and arithmetic does. And the most important fact to remember, because we cannot teach others something we don't know ourselves, in teaching our children emotional intelligence, we need to boost our own. In that way, Our little ones are our spiritual teachers. So, what is emotional intelligence? I'm just showing to you the factors of emotional intelligence: self-regulation, self-awareness first, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skills. You can probably research it more, but you understand that small children don't have social skills yet. They don't have empathy yet. They don't know how to motivate themselves yet. So we need to have emotional intelligence in order to teach our children all these good skills. So Einstein, who is arguably the smartest person living in the 20th century, said everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. So at this point in time, I am aware that you may feel a little overwhelmed with all the information I am blasting you with. But this is because our brain is extremely complicated. The interesting fact, though, our brain has not been upgraded, so to speak, for 40,000 years. So that's part of the reason why being a happy parent is not easy. Our brains were not necessarily built to make us feel relaxed, just for our survival. And the survival of our kids. So, what effective parents do is often intuitive and sometimes counterintuitive. My 5 step SMART system was designed to make things a little simpler, but not simpler than they are. Structure gives us freedom, and the SMART structure allows parents and caregivers to think quick on their feet. As I mentioned before, our little ones will not have fully developed brains for about 2 decades, and the most valuable real estate in the brain is found in the frontal lobes. Until children have their frontal lobes fully online, adults must be their external source of all that good stuff: emotional regulation, response flexibility, and so forth, and gradually withhold the amount of supervision given in order for children to become good decision makers and thrive themselves. Emotional intelligence requires the brain to be ready for these downloads, but it is in the first 5 years that we build the foundation, creating an I'm okay, you're okay dynamic with the child. This is what smart parenting allows. This is what Dr. Pickler, Waldorf education, Montessori are about: creating the safe environment for the child so that they can learn effectively. The not so effective approaches are I am okay, you're not okay. This will wire in fear and avoidance in a child. I am not okay, you're okay. This is the permissive behavior of a parent who does know how to set limits, how to say no. This will create narcissistic kids who feel entitled and ultimately dysfunctional. I'm not okay, you're not okay. This was my meltdown. When my son was melting down, I also was throwing a tantrum. That is something that I definitely wouldn't have done with my grandchildren. So, by relating to our kids from the I am okay, you're okay dynamic, we contribute to the development of frontal lobes, and we create the areas of integration in the brain that allows our children to have their frontal lobes online when they're challenged later in life. So frontal lobes, it's my favorite part of the brain. And I'm suggesting to you that it is the best return on investment. So when you build the child's brain, this is the best investment to make. And Elsa and Pia shared with you some ideas how to make the rapid development of frontal lobes in the early years. Because the age of maturity of frontal lobes is between, as I said, 20 and 25. So, meanwhile, we need to have our own emotional intelligence, and the subset of emotional intelligence that is incredibly important is executive function. So we as parents have to create good executive functioning, which is also housed in the frontal lobes, and working memory, um, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility are the two wonderful parts of good executive functioning. Here in the United States, we have the epidemic of executive function problems. It is expressed in ADHD, also defined behavior as criminality. When I test people in prison, I see a lot of executive dysfunction. When I treat people who have ADHD, they also have difficulty with this. So applying it to parenting, working memory requires you to remember what you're working on. And you are requiring, you should remember that you want your child to be happy. So keeping that in your working memory is important. Inhibition, we need to inhibit anger, blaming, shaming behaviors. This is what I wasn't very good at. And then when I was a new mom, but I'm definitely much better now. And I help my parents who I work with to create good inhibitory control. And then cognitive flexibility. Cognitive flexibility is a really important feature for the effective parent or teacher, because the interesting thing with children, things change very rapidly. What worked yesterday would not work today. What works with one child doesn't work with another child. So mental flexibility, cognitive flexibility allows us to understand that sometimes we need to think quick on our feet, and if option A is not available, then we need to develop B, C, and sometimes many more, and fail as fast as we can to see what works. So this is what cognitive flexibility allows us. SMART that I created allows us to have the set of executive functioning skills, and it is the 5-step program. So it engages our own organ of civilization, our frontal lobes, what I call the magical wand of the brain. When we are triggered on the verge of flipping our lids, we can pause and get ourselves in the green zone. We know that stressed brains don't learn well, and we also know that they don't teach well. In the United States, as I said, we do have some results of our parenting being focused on helping children feel, I'm the best cereal eater in the world, but it produced a lot of entitled and narcissistic kids who are afraid of failing, and they a lot of times stop being creative, and they're not critical thinkers. So when we use fear, when we don't recognize what the request is in the tantrum, then we develop real estate in a very different part of the brain, which is our amygdala. And the amygdala is wired for the very fast fight or flight or freeze response. So if the interventions that are triggering child's fear are repeated, then this lightning fast fight, flight, or freeze or appease response is wired into the child's brain. And I think this is what happened with me when I was parenting my son. The faster that response gets into the childhood, the harder it is to interrupt decades down the road. More often not than not, that is how clients find their way into my office. When the brain is not yet developed, tantrum is the way children communicate to us, asking, is he hungry, tired, needs to be comforted, reassured, seen, heard. Stay tuned, inhibit the impulse to say stop. by reminding yourself to pause and stay listening until you have a plan. Remember, structure gives us freedom. When our ancient brains, the parts of that predate the most recent evolutionary strides, behave badly, there is always a request in every tantrum. What is the root of the problem? What is the need that is expressed? When we pause and listen, we can figure it out, but we cannot do it when we are having a meltdown too. There is a sense of freedom parents may experience when they realize I cannot always control my kids, but I can control my responses. I teach parents to reframe their perception of their children not as misbehaving annoyance, but a little person whose brain is not developed yet, who is doing the best that they can with what they have, with what little they have, who is trying to learn a language they don't speak, and frustrated, resorting to the only language they actually know. That reframing creates a collaborative relationship where a parent takes responsibility for the ultimate win-win solution to the problem. Collaborative relationship with a child requires you to be an effective leader until a child's brain is mature enough. Now, let me go back to SMART that I created, and I will apply all the steps to the experience I had when Andrew, my son, was little, and how I would have done it differently now. The first step is safe. So asking yourself, I was safe here. So of course we were safe, even though I felt unsafe because I thought that people were judging me. There was no real danger. So if it is safe, then I can say, okay, you don't need to rush. Just think about it. It's being mindful, being lovingly aware of all your feelings, and allowing yourself to feel that you are being triggered, that you are going in the red zone, and not pretend it is not happening. So here I would start doing little simple tricks that I teach all my parents who I work with. Just relax the mouth on the floor, the tongue on the floor of the mouth, open hands, just relax the muscles. Being attuned into your suffering is important. Notice, oh, you're suffering, and allow your suffering to inform you, to be attuned to yourself, give yourself a little self compassion. I teach all my clients the art of self compassion. That is how we replace shame with self compassion. When you give yourself a little support, you can be more resilient. Resilience is about bouncing back. Resilience allows us to decide what we need to do in order to stop the suffering. Resilience allows us to bounce back quickly. Trust is the next step. You need to trust yourself that you can figure things out, that you are knowledgeable enough, and you need to trust your little one that he is your ally. I needed to trust myself that if I listen to my heart, not to my fear, if I listen to my love, not to my fear, I can intuitively figure things out. I would have gotten to his level. I would have made eye contact. I would have said in a very soft tone of voice, sweetheart, I know you're tired. I know, I know, I know. Let me give you a hug. Let's figure out what's going on. I know it's hard for you to make good decisions now. Let me help you. And then tenacity. If everything else fails, you can always learn from the experience. So tenacity has to do with having, it is called growth mindset, not fixed mindset. Growth mindset is what allows us to continue persevering and thriving. So when you start doing this, the more you do it, the easier it becomes. And after a while, it becomes a very quick practice. Um, Brain checklist when you check from the bottom up, from the deep structures of your brain to neurostructures, neocortex. So in summary, we talked about how emotional intelligence is the precursor of your child's success and how to be a skilled teacher and programmer and architect and real estate investor of your child's developing brain. We talked about developing the happiness advantage in your little ones starting early by giving them what they need to be happy children. We talked about how to use pause and plan rather than fight, flight, appease, or freeze, and how modeling emotional intelligence to our kids is the only way we teach them crucial skills. So I hope that I helped you understand why what happens in childhood doesn't stay in childhood and how we can prevent hurtful patterns from being hardwired by replacing shame with love, fear with compassion. So next time someone asks you, what would you like your child to be when she grows up? I hope you'd answer, I want her to be happy. With that in mind, when you are about to flip your lid, allow yourself to choose to focus on what you can control yourself. You can say, I'm doing the best that I can, and I can do better if I am kind and forgiving to myself. Then I can be kinder to my little one. When there is a choice between fear and love, if you can, choose love and be smart with two T's about it. And this is closing thoughts. Marianne Williamson, who ran for the president in this country recently, said that there is no single effort more radical in its potential for saving the world than a transformation of the way we raise our children. COVID, corona epidemic showed to us that we are all connected. The world is interdependent. So if we are responsible parents, we'll raise responsible kids who know how to collaborate, and the world will be a better place. Thank you.